I guess I would say to the judges, be prepared to be blown away.
Douglas by Robert E. Hayden.
Know not the anguish of that breast.
We Wear the Mask by Paul.
Come up from the fields, Father.
This flea is you and I in this our
Poets, painters.
To measure the understanding that a student has of a poem, the first thing is to listen to the way that they seem to be interpreting and understanding what they're saying. There's one thing to recite. I mean, it's the simplest thing to just keep saying the words over and over again. But to recite with meaning and with some ability to communicate with the individual, that becomes important. And it's easy to know if the student gets the poem. I mean, while there are markers in the punctuation and in the structure of the poem that we can follow, there's also a way in which the emotional range and direction and intention of the poem is conveyed through the way that the student performs it. And so watching that is quite easy to recognize.
So if it's a poem that requires the student to really think through its grammar in ways than a poem that has more plain language, it's going to get a higher difficulty score.
I think the student should speak at a comfortable volume and should follow the rhythms that the poem suggests. There can be a temptation sometimes to recite in a sing-song manner when a poem rhymes, and I think that should be avoided. The student should speak loud enough, but not too loud, and should pronounce every word clearly.
I think the key thing to remember, and that we expect students to remember, is that the poem comes first. Everything else that you do with your body, with your voice, with your arms, whatever you do, has to be in service of the poem. If your body takes over and becomes the lead in this dialogue, then the poem disappears. The one thing about poetry out loud is that the poem comes first. What we want the person to do is to think about the poem when they leave, and therefore it takes incredible economy of body expression to convey what is happening with the poem. But physical presence also is about owning a space. People think you have to sort of wave your arms and jump and dance to own a space. It doesn't mean that. It means when you step on the stage, you behave as if you're the only person in that space, and you're dominated by your voice and by your physical demeanor and presence and so on.
It means that the student brings, and I put drama in quotes, but brings the drama that's appropriate to the content of the poem. And I also think that it means that the student does not substitute what I would consider artificial emotion for the poem's appropriateness. If the poem is dealing with difficult subject matter, the student should maintain his or her poise and not let the content of the poem give him or her license to become an actor or a theater performer, but to sort of let the poem work through them and not impose their own interpretation on the poem.
I think one of the most important things in all performance is not rushing it. Using silence and pauses well, and that takes a real confidence to know when to use that pause and not be frightened of having to fill in every moment.
When I think of a poetry slam, I think of the performer, the contestant, can deploy and use things like body language, facial expression, body movement, and they can bring more of their own personality to the poem. Typically, they're performing a poem of their own. In contrast, in the Poetry Out Loud competition, and here I would invoke something I've always held and believed, something that Robert Pinsky said many years ago, and that is that it's another person's work of art that's working through the contestant's body. And so you're trying to let the poem do the work and not impose yourself onto the poem. And so a Poetry Out Loud competition is where the poem is the protagonist, and in a slam competition, the poet is the protagonist.
Well, it is an extremely fast-paced process, and just staying focused and keeping up with each student, because there is so much going on, and you're thinking about so many elements of the rubric all at once. I think the main thing is to just really stay in the moment with the student and try not to be distracted in your own mind by other things, because it can be very, just very intense. Mm-hmm. I guess one thing you need to do is kind of pull back your investment in terms of preferring one poem over another.
I think it's important to pay very close attention with your eyes and your ears to the student reciting, and be conservative in scoring. It's very easy to come out of the box giving high scores. Mm-hmm. You'll see some amazing students, and there'll be time to recognize that.
Everybody I know who's judged has been more than happy to do it again, because it's just such an amazing process. You get a sense of poetry mattering in the world in a way it hasn't done for a little while, beyond the sort of little world of poets. So, and it transforms kids' lives. So one of the things that judges love to do is to talk with the kids afterwards and to just listen to their stories. The shy kids who are suddenly coming alive in front of an audience, the kids who have never succeeded in anything, the kids who have never been to the big capital of North Carolina. It makes a huge difference for these kids. You look at Will and how it's changed his life, you look at other national champions and how it changes their lives, and then you multiply that by 325,000. So it's definitely worth working on.